For more insight on all this aid flooding into Ukraine from the G7 and the U.S., I'm joined by Klaus Larres, Professor of History and International Affairs, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He is an expert on modern U.S. and economic, foreign, and security policies. Good to see you, Professor. Let me start with this. All this aid that's been flooding into Ukraine, in the beginning we were all worried it wasn't all going to get there, but now it seems like more and more of it is getting there. How would you rate the success of all of that aid in Ukraine?
So far, it has been highly successful. I think without that enormous aid, particularly military aid, which has come into Ukraine, Ukraine would probably have been conquered by Russia. That Ukraine was able to withstand that enormous onslaught initially and still going on in eastern Ukraine by Russia, that I think is largely due to the will and willpower of the Ukrainian soldiers and population, but also to the economic aid and above all military aid, which has flown into Ukraine from Western states and from NATO.
There's more and more discussion about rebuilding, and from what I've heard, it may be a little premature to talk about that because the conflict is still going on. I mean, there's a lot to be settled here. Do you think that, in terms of aid, they have to continue to focus on getting more aid, or is it the right aid?
Well, at the moment, I think it's mostly military aid, and also, as we heard, the G7 has decided on to make up the budget downfall in Ukraine, in Kyiv. A bankruptcy of the Kyiv government has to be prevented, and the G7 has agreed that that will be the case by giving over $18 million to the government for the next 3 months in order to prevent the bankruptcy of the government. But eventually, after the war is finished, and hopefully the war will eventually be finished and kind of soon, really, then of course rebuilding of the country will be immensely expensive. The whole country, or let's say a large part of the country, has been utterly destroyed. Infrastructure has been destroyed, bridges, roads, factories, and of course civilian infrastructure as well, including hospitals and schools. All that needs to be rebuilt. And while there are lots of calls that Russia will have to pay up for that because they started the war, they are the aggressors, but in the end one wonders whether Russia will be able to do so. So in the end the money has to come mostly from Western countries and perhaps international institutions like the World Bank and similar.
Right. Now, I mean, you're saying Russia's the aggressor, but I mean, obviously there's some people who disagree with that. But my question here is, who should be responsible for leading the, quote, rebuilding process when it's time?
Well, it should be the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government knows, of course, best what they want to rebuild, how they want to rebuild it, and they are dependent on financial aid, particularly from Western countries, but hopefully also from Russia. But I think clearly it should be the Ukrainian government. It's a sovereign, independent government, and they should be in charge. It would be strange if an international organization or the United States or Russia would be in charge of rebuilding Ukraine. That is, of course, a task for the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people itself.
What happens if this conflict is prolonged beyond summer, fall, winter? And I've heard some estimates it could go on for more than a couple years.
Yes, that will be terrible for the people of Ukraine, of course, but it will be terrible for the international economy, for the global economy as well. We already hear about serious supply chain problems. We hear about food problems, rising and escalating energy prices, which in particular hits the poorer countries of this world. Particularly many countries in Africa, the Middle East, also in Asia, are affected by the food scarcity, which is already working itself through the supply chains. And it would be a terrible scenario if the war went on beyond the summer or perhaps even into next year. Therefore, I believe that urgent mediation efforts should take place. And that is what we are lacking at the moment, serious mediation efforts. There were some serious mediation efforts before, particularly those led by Turkey, but they seem to have come to an end, or at least not much is happening right now. And I think it would be high time to start the diplomatic offensive again and to try to overcome the war, because otherwise it will be even more expensive than it is already. Right. Of course, the people will suffer even more than they are suffering already.
Right. But Professor, last question here. There's been some criticism that, oh, it's several Western countries, you know, helping Ukraine to fight Russia, and that's the narrative you often hear. When the aid gets bigger and bigger, if this gets prolonged, wouldn't it be in the interest of I guess, the G7 to include more countries? India, China, there are hundreds of countries that could possibly be included, not just 7 that could help and be responsible for the rebuilding efforts, could they not?
Absolutely. No, I would be fully in favor of that. The G20 should be involved, and countries who are not part of the G20 should also be involved if they are willing to be involved. Also, mediators should not be limited to countries like Turkey or Israel. There are many other possible countries in the world who might make a successful mediator. India comes to mind, for example. They have kept fairly neutral in the conflict so far. Also, China comes to mind, but there is no willingness so far among most countries in the world to seemingly act as a mediator. But I think any country which can contribute to bring the conflict, the war to an end would be more than welcome. And I think that should be the immediate effort we should embark upon.
Yeah, I think everyone's echoing the same thing, that we would like this conflict to end. Klaus Larres, professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, thank you very much for your insights.